Welcome back to the second half of segment 7 of Pirates, Smugglers, and the Making of the Modern World. We've been talking in the first half. We're going to continue to talk in the second half today about the social history of pirates. And as we left off in the first half, I was talking about women pirates in the West, and we used the first example of Grace O'Malley in Ireland. Now we're going to look at two cases which I touched upon briefly when we were talking about pirates of the Spanish Main, but we want to look at these women a little more closely. The first is Mary Read. Now, Mary was born in England, in London. She was an illegitimate child. She was not the child of her mother's husband. Her mother and the mother's husband had a child, a young boy, and then Mary was born as a result of her mother's relationship with another man shortly after. At about the same time as Mary's birth, her mother's husband died at sea. Mary's mother is now left in a situation where her only source of income, potential income, is from her late husband's family, to try to ensure that they will give her some money for her support and her daughter's support, her son having died along with her husband. She dresses Mary in boys' clothes, male clothes, so that her late husband's family will think that Mary is the son that she conceived by her late husband. So in this effort to secure money by the mother, Mary winds up dressing as a boy through her early life, and indeed through most of her life she dressed as a man. She took up a career in the military, serving as both a soldier and a sailor on the European continent in places like Flanders and Netherlands. She was considered a very heroic soldier in combat, and faced down a number of enemy and killed a number of the enemy during her ventures in Europe. However, she finally decided to try to seek her fortune in the West Indies, but while sailing to the West Indies, the ship that she was on was captured by pirates. She was taken on board that ship, and from there became a pirate herself. She fell in love with one of her fellow crewmen, and that relationship was threatened when her lover got into an argument with another pirate. The other pirate demanded a duel. Mary's boyfriend wasn't that good at dueling, so Mary went out and insulted the other pirate and demanded a duel with him first, and then proceeded to kill the pirate who threatened her lover's life. So she was a woman of considerable means in terms of protecting her own interests. She finally fell in with, of course, Calico Jack Rackman's crew. And it was while serving with Calico Jack Rackman in the Spanish Main that she was captured along with Calico Jack and his crew. And we'll talk a little bit more about what happened to Mary later on. But she was considered a very able-bodied member of the crew, and clearly was highly effective in combat, both as a soldier in Europe and later as a pirate in the Spanish Main. The other case is that of Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny was also illegitimate, born in this case in Ireland. Why she wore boys' clothes, and she did that, male clothes, from an early age, and was probably simply out of personal preference. There is not a story akin to that of Mary Read, where your mother's trying to hide your identity, make you look like your late half brother, etc. This seemed to be just a matter of personal preference. In fact, Mary's father recognized her, and when he decided to leave Ireland and go to South Carolina to take up a career as a planter, he took Anne with him, and well, it's a little difficult to say she settled down, but she lived for a time in Charleston. While she was living there, a young gentleman of the town tried to rape Anne. She proceeded to beat him within an inch of his life, which meant from then on she was pretty well left alone by other males who might threaten her well-being. She then took up with a sailor who her father felt was worth nothing, as he described him, and her father finally expelled her from the house because of the kind of people she was hanging around with, particularly this sailor. She runs off to sea with him, and in the course of those adventures, she herself becomes a pirate, and she too joins the crew of Calico Jack Rackham. Now, Mary, or I should say Anne actually developed a close emotional relationship with Calico Jack, and they were lovers during her time on board his ship as a part of his crew. When Calico Jack and his crew are captured, it is Mary and Anne who put up the staunchest defense of the ship. They, however, are captured along with Calico Jack. Jack is, of course, sentenced to death, and Anne sees her former lover on the way to the gallows, and she is quoted as saying, "If he'd fought like a man, he need not have hanged like a dog," meaning she didn't think much of him as a combat artist, because he had surrendered almost as soon as he saw the British naval vessel bearing down on him, whereas Anne and her friend Mary managed to fight on. Now, both of the women were put on trial for piracy, and both of them were certain to be convicted. However, they came up with a means of delaying the ultimate punishment, which would have been execution along with the male members of the crew, and that is both of them were pregnant. Anne by Calico Jack, we're not sure about Mary, so there was a certain pregnant pause. Now, what happened to them exactly, we're not sure. Well, we do know about Mary. Mary died of some type of disease while she was in prison. There are no records to indicate what Anne's eventual fate was, other than she was spared the death sentence and probably would have been treated fairly leniently because of having a child. So she certainly would have escaped the worst of the sentences imposed for piracy. But on the other hand, whether she in fact escaped the prison entirely will probably never be known, because we don't have the records to indicate what actually happened to her. Now, with these cases, we look at Grace O'Malley and Mary Read and Anne, we see, again, exceptional situations where women break through barriers, in part, at least for two of them, and Grace, too, to a degree at least. So they cut her hair short like a man. In part, they took on at least some of the exterior appearance, and many of their fellow crew members, at least from Mary and Anne, Bonnie, weren't always positive that they were women. Most of them assumed that they were men, at least for a time. Eventually, the truth got out. But in part, they managed to break through these barriers by making themselves appear to be males. But they are, again, exceptions. There are few women on board these ships. Much of the argument, again, goes towards wanting to exclude women from one of the few opportunities of employment for the desperately poor in the West at this time. And another argument that is raised, in addition to this, and to sort of compound it, is that the presence of women on board ship would be disruptive because, of course, there'll be competition over sexual relationships, and this will cause disruption on the ship itself. That had some truth to it, but that was largely because if pirate ships had any women on them, they tended to be few in number. So yes, you're going to create problems because you only have a few women there to begin with. So this is going to cause jealousies and competitions, etc. As a result, these two presumptions about women being a destabilizing force, and I think more importantly, wanting deliberately to exclude women to keep this a male sphere of activity, meant that the women that we've cited do tend to be the exception rather than the rule. There are other cases in the West, but again, they're a small minority. However, when we shift and look at China, we see a very different situation. With the women pirates of China, women constitute a substantial part of the crews of pirate vessels in the South China Sea, in the case that we looked at. This largely appears to be the case because of the water world, shall we say, that the pirates came from. Remember, these were boat people, people who had grown up and lived on the coast on these boats, whose society was largely detached from that of the mainland over time. And their major source of economic activity and income was fishing. And on the sampans that were used for fishing, women played a central role. I mean, the boat was the only place you had to live and work. You lived there, you slept there, you ate there, and you worked there. And inevitably, the women on board worked equally with the men in terms of setting out the nets, pulling them in, preparing the fish, etc. So they played an equal role. And in that process, they also learned a good deal about navigation, about activities as a sailor. So they were just as equipped as men at any given moment to take on those roles. And in fact, when pirates are looking for skilled individuals to help work on their ships, they're going to have to turn to women because at least half of the skilled seamen, I guess that's a misnomer, half of the people with skills in terms of seamanship are women. So this early experience and the fact that the labor force already included a large number of women translated into a situation where large numbers of pirates in the South China Sea were women. Now, we looked at the most striking example, Cheng Yisao, who was the prostitute who married Cheng Ai and became his confidant and played a central role in organizing the pirate confederation that eventually came to dominate the South China Sea in the early 19th century. Furthermore, not only was she central in putting that confederation together and holding it together, as we described in last week's session, she was also critical in the eventual decision to surrender and accept a assignment of an official position and also be able to retain much of the crew and the set of ships that they had in their fleet. She was the one that insisted that her new husband, her former adopted son, break off initial negotiations with the Chinese government, sail away, and act as if he was going to refuse to negotiate any further. And it was that ploy eventually that brought the Chinese government around and won them a considerable reward in terms of his official position, and their amnesty and their right to retain their ships was because of what she counseled and in what she in fact did to direct those negotiations. So she plays a major role essentially in brokering the peace. But in Asia, although she's the only case that we have that we can clearly document of an individual and give her a name and talk about her specific activities, nevertheless, we know that in Asia it is a very different situation than in the West, because in Asia a large part, probably not half, but a substantial portion, let's say a third of the crews were women. So inevitably we do have situations where women are taking on roles, and not just as ordinary crewmen, but as first mates, as captains of vessels, etc. It's just that Cheng Yisao happens to be the one that we know the most about because of her very prominent role. But in the West, when we contrast it, we see that in the West there is, on the one hand, a desire by males to exclude women from these positions for employment opportunities, and there was also the argument added to that, well, that the presence of women on board ship will be disruptive because of sexual competition. Now, another aspect of pirate society that we need to look at, and one that is perhaps best known for, is violence among pirates. And people tell stories about pirates in large part because they want to recount these awful and gruesome stories of what they did, how many people they killed, how many ships they sank, how many people they tortured, etc. And we're going to talk about some of that, at least some of the more gruesome examples, which are always easy to remember. But they need to be put in context. In the context of Western societies in particular, but Asian societies as well, in the 17th and 18th centuries. These were societies where brutality, and official brutality, was pervasive and accepted as the norm. For example, relatively minor crimes, petty theft, could lead to a punishment such as 40 or 50 lashes being inflicted on someone. And this is for stealing a loaf of bread or something. You get beaten to a pulp by being whipped. Another common punishment, although for somewhat more serious crimes, was the press yard, where essentially the name pretty well describes it. They put giant stones on your body, or they use mechanical devices to press down on your chest, and depending upon the punishment, either do you a lot of physical damage by breaking your ribs, etc., and damaging some of your organs, or taken to its logical extreme, killing you by crushing you to death. Again, not a very happy outcome. And in fact, Britain, where this was a common practice, considered itself to have very humane laws and be engaged in very humane treatment of criminals. This was considered humane treatment, to crush them to death. Another favorite in Europe in particular was tongue piercing, which was not a fashion statement at the time, nor was it an indication that you had a particular affinity for hard rock or heavy metal music. This punishment was usually reserved, not always, for people who had committed crimes of heresy, who were involved in making religious statements that were contrary to the prevailing Christian beliefs. What would happen is they would take a burning metal rod and thrust it through your tongue, which left a large burning hole in your tongue. And had the additional advantage of meaning that you wouldn't be going around preaching heresy anymore because you wouldn't be able to talk very well. So tongue piercing was another punishment, although, again, it's usually reserved for people who are engaged in heretical activities or perhaps are making political statements that are considered unwise or threatening. Another favorite was drawing and quartering. Although you didn't have to do both, you could just settle on one, depending upon what the sentence of the court was. Drawing, of course, was really putting people on a rack, as we've talked about some pirates doing, and stretching the person's body. You would have your feet tied down, and then your arms would be tied to ropes that were attached to a cylinder, and as they turned the cylinder, your body would be stretched. Your arms and your legs would be pulled away from your torso. Your joints would start to come apart, and you'd wind up sort of like a rag doll in the end if you managed to survive. If you did manage to survive, there was always the additional attraction of quartering, where they cut you up in pieces as a part of your punishment. Assuming you were still alive, they'd cut you up, and this, needless to say, was very painful, having your body parts cut off you one by one just after they've all been ripped out of your joints. Finally, for particularly notorious criminals, there was always the head on the pike idea, which was to take your head once you had been quartered properly and put it on a pike and put it on display as a reminder to the general populace and to those with criminal inclinations exactly what the punishments could be for that kind of behavior. And many of these punishments, particularly lashes and drawing and quartering, were often done in public. Hanging, of course, was a common one, but we don't consider that nearly so gruesome these days. I don't know why. But in any case, many of these punishments were carried out before the public and were considered a form of amusement, that this was a form of entertainment. Supposedly the official explanation is that we're demonstrating to the populace, what the penalties are for crime. We're instilling social control in people so they'll realize just how serious these penalties are. But that's sort of like, a cable network trying to get permission to film an execution, Is that really why you think people are watching this, so they can learn just how terrible it's going to be if they commit a crime? No, they're watching it for entertainment purposes, and that was pretty much true. And these days it was sort of like, going downtown Houston to, go to one of the international festival or one of the other million festivals they have, there'd be people selling food and, little dolls with, somebody hanging from a rope. It was a major day of social entertainment when people were executed, and the more gruesome, the more it was enjoyed by the crowd. Now, given that these are things that are being done to people by the state systems that exist, both in the West and in Asia, which are the two major areas we've talked about. We could talk about the Ottoman Empire would fit in pretty much the same way. You can understand that, well, many pirate behaviors and their treatment of prisoners, their treatment of enemies, etc., is extremely gruesome. It really was well within, shall we say, the norm for behaviors in society at the time. And pirates carried out some of these same punishments either on fellow crewmen or on prisoners. Lashes were fairly typical. Drawing and quartering might be engaged in. They usually didn't hang people. They just throw you off the ship if they wanted to kill you. They might just stab you with a sword. But some of these punishments were used by pirates either to punish crewmen or as acts of revenge against the crews of naval vessels that they had encountered and defeated, to extract confessions or extract information from prisoners, or just for the sheer pleasure of torturing someone. However, there were certain tortures that the pirates excelled in and were relatively unique to their own society. One was called sweating, which is actually a lot worse than it sounds. Sweating involved taking the offending individual, was usually a crewman, this is what you did to your fellow crewman, who had committed some type of crime or offense, and the crewman would have to run a gauntlet consisting of his fellow crew members. Each of those crew members was holding a sail needle, and a sail needle is a very long needle that you use to sew the canvas, or to sew the sail, so it's nice and long and very sharp. And they would stab you as you went by. So by the time you got to the end of the gauntlet, your body was covered in large holes that were oozing blood. Now, if that were it, you could say, well, I guess I can get through that. It's not that bad. Seen worse on reality shows. But once they were done with that, they then took you and threw you into a sugar barrel. One of the wooden casks that they had that they would carry sugar in. And then they threw in a large number of cockroaches, which weren't too difficult to find because they were crawling all over the place. And they'd stuff them in there with you and a little bit of sugar just to lighten things up a bit. And then they threw a heavy tarp over you, maybe an old sail, and left you there for at least the next 24 hours. This was a common torture in the Spanish Main, where temperatures are very high. You get tropical weather, so let's say the temperature's 90 degrees, it's humid, you're inside this cask, the sun is beating down, and the roaches are crawling all over you, eating your blood. This was one of the penalties that could be inflicted upon you on a pirate vessel, and very often it was used for crewmen, although it was an extreme. I mean, someone had to do something very naughty to be victimized with the sweating treatment. Wolding is one we've already seen. I just didn't give you the name of it. Wolding was used in this manner, again, where you take a leather strap, wrap it around a person's head, then put a dowel into it, and begin twisting so that the strap begins to pull in on the person's skull until their eyes start to pop out. This was one used particularly for extracting information from someone. You can imagine that if you use sweating on a prisoner that you're trying to get information from, it's a little difficult for him to talk while you're stabbing him with sail nails or, throwing a top over him, leaving him with cockroaches. But in this case, the prisoner can always, raise his hand and say, okay, I think I know the answer. So this one was used mostly for extracting information. You keep applying the pressure, shall we say, until such time as the person finally talks. Then there is, of course, you are the fire beneath my feet, roasting people's feet, putting their feet into hot coals was another punishment, and could also be used to extract information. If this didn't work, there was good old-fashioned roasting, which meant they roasted your entire body. What they would do is put you on a spit, and they tied you to the spit, and then they roasted you over flame or coals, usually coals, because you lasted longer that way, since the flame would usually sear your skin right off. This was another extreme punishment to which people would be subjected, and generally speaking, it was assumed you were not going to survive that one. Another punishment, or torture, depending upon how you want to look at it, was hoisting. This one is still used today in torture in modern states. It's where you tie a person's hands behind their back, and then you tie a rope to those hands, and you hoist them up, in this case, onto the mast of the ship. In more recent times, they just put a hook in a ceiling in various police states, and they hoist you up and leave you hanging there for hours or even days, periodically throwing water on you because you will pass out from the sheer agony of the pain from being hung up like that. On one occasion, one pirate captain did hoist somebody by his testicles, but he was nice enough after a short time to cut the individual's testicles off, so he then fell to the ground and was spared at least some of the agony. Another example of, let's say, extreme behavior by pirates was Captain Orlonais, a French pirate. Captain Orlonais was probably a psychopath. He was sent to the Spanish Main as an indentured servant when he was just a young boy. He eventually managed to free himself from indenture, became a seaman and then a pirate. As a pirate captain, he was not a very pleasant person. On one occasion, he captured a Spanish vessel off the island of Cuba while the crew was sleeping. He locked down the crew below decks and then allowed them up on deck one by one so that he could cut their heads off and take the pleasure of doing it one at a time. It took a while, but he managed to get through all of it. So he's a very unpleasant person. He had been known for violent actions, but one of his most violent actions was against a prisoner who he stabbed in the chest and cut his heart out. And then there are two different stories, and it's hard to know which to believe. One says that he then forced another prisoner to eat the heart. The other says that he ate it himself. And it's hard to say which is the correct case. Apparently what he was trying to do was extract information from other people that he had captured in concerning treasure, and he felt that this display of barbarity would help evoke some very quick answers on his questions when they either saw him or the prisoner eating this human heart. Now, then there was Montbars the Exterminator. He's best remembered for a little trick where he took a prisoner on board his ship, slashed the man's abdomen open, ripped out one end of his intestine, and nailed it to the mast of his ship. Needless to say, the prisoner was in considerable pain, and then he applied a hot iron to his posterior, leading the man to go running down the deck of the ship with his entrails being dragged out behind him until, of course, he ran out of entrail and then collapsed dead on the ship. That's my little quote here. He's at the end of his intestine. And then Captain Lowe, who captured a merchant vessel off of Block Island, and as an example of animosity towards captains, he cut the ears off the captain of the merchant vessel and then made the captain eat them. And according to a witness who was not a pirate, the captain very obligingly ate the ears without any protest, obviously realizing that if he didn't, he'd wind up dead instead of just lacking a couple of ear coverings. So he was forced to eat his own ears. These cases are indications of some of the extremes to which pirates went in imposing penalties on prisoners and even on their own crew at times. Now, some of the ones that I've just cited are, of course, extreme and tended to be exceptional. These were usually acts of psychopaths. I mean, eating someone's heart, cutting their internal organs out and nailing them to a ship mast are pretty extreme. However, most cases of torture or punishment were of the type that fell within the general norm, as much as we may not consider it normal today, the general norm of society at the time in terms of inflicting punishment. And generally, most cases had at least a rational motive. We don't have to call it humane, but rational in the sense that either they were punishing a crew member for some misbehavior, or they were trying to extract information, particularly about treasure, from prisoners that they had captured. And so there is a logic, at least to much of this, and much of it fell within the norm. However, we also have to admit that there are these extreme cases, like Olonais and others, who were obviously, and like Blackbeard, people who were sociopaths or psychopaths, and often did this for the sheer pleasure of inflicting pain on other human beings. Of course, we also know that this kind of behavior goes on even today. There are all kinds of police states around the world that inflict equally brutal, if not more brutal, punishments, because many of these kinds of torture go on for much longer than the kinds of torturous acts that I've just described here. So the most extreme cases tend to be the exception, and they tend to be acts of people who are either sociopaths or psychopaths, but much of it was within the norm of society and how people were punished at the time and had at least rational motivation behind it. The next topic is the one of homosexuality among pirates. And in talking about this, it's important to put this in historical context to help make it understandable. Just briefly, human societies, at least civilized societies, have long tended towards categorization of information. I mean, we tend to categorize information. You know, the ancient Greeks wanted to be able to talk about the physical world and categorize everything in it. It was either earth, water, or fire. Okay, that explained the entire physical world. It was one of those. By the 18th century in Europe, by the period of the Enlightenment, the idea of categorization had gone much further. The whole idea that in order to comprehend the world, we have to be able to categorize information, and this is a very rationally driven procedure. The development of encyclopedias is a part of this. Doesn't sound very interesting. You know, you think of encyclopedias that are sold today, but the creation of encyclopedias in the 18th century was the idea of categorizing information, making it understandable and manipulable. This kind of approach is really essential in many ways for societies to function, particularly from early modern times down to the present. But it can also lead to problems because sometimes we run into categorizations that cause as much confusion as they do enlightenment. What about things that fall into two categories? Physical scientists, physicists deal with issues of atomic and subatomic particles, and the question of, are they matter, are they energy, do they have the characteristics of one, the other, both? So it can create problems. This is relevant in terms of homosexuality because by the late 19th century, scientists were trying to categorize human behavior. You know, are you an extrovert, an introvert? Are you neurotic, psychotic? Are you an A-type personality, a B-type personality? Or are you just boring? We want to categorize human behavior. And one area of human behavior that was being categorized by then, and one of the ways that we tend to think about human behavior today in categories, is sexual behavior. That, well, what are you? Are you heterosexual? Are you homosexual? Are you bisexual? As if we can take people's behavior and categorize it. The fact is that sexual activity and sexual preference isn't necessarily easily categorized, that human beings don't fit into nice, neat boxes when we talk about their behavior. And back in the time that we're talking about, the 17th century, the 18th century, people recognized homosexual behavior, but they didn't tend to categorize that behavior as representing a specific isolated group in society. Just as we might say today, well, you're engaged in adultery. Okay, so you're an adulterer. But we then don't treat those people as if they are a separate category of people with a separate set of values, etc. They may have done something that we see as outside our socially acceptable sphere, but we don't treat them as a separate community. That is true back in the time we're talking about. And furthermore, as we will see, human behaviors are highly complex. So when you hear about this and say, well, that doesn't make sense. How can people be doing both this and that at the same time? Or why would they want to do that? It's because human behavior is, in fact, that complex and intricate, and you can't easily categorize human beings. Now, the first question about homosexuality and pirates is, how common was it, at least in the West? Because we're going to deal, again, just as with women, there are two different experiences here between the West and Asia. It's difficult to say, and it's a highly debated argument. It is argued by some historians, and there seems to be some decent evidence, that homosexual behavior was highly prevalent among pirates, and indeed among ship crews in general, not just pirates. That, well, most people would not think in terms of a gay population or a gay community in societies. Nevertheless, the fact is that there was a high level of homosexual activity on ships, and especially on pirate ships. Why does this happen? One theory has to do with what's called the total institution. A total institution is an institution where membership and departure from the institution are both highly selective. Difficult to become a member and difficult to leave. More importantly, a total institution is one in which people mix together on every aspect of their lives. In other words, you eat together, you work together, you play together, you sleep together. Your whole life is defined by interaction with this group of people in this institution. What is an example? Prison is an example of this. Okay? Asylums would be another example. And of course, pirate ships would be another example. In these circumstances, oftentimes, although they can be encouraging towards violent behavior, they also tend to develop high levels of affectionate relationships between the human beings who are in these institutions, these total institutions that encompass their entire life. You see fairly high levels of homosexual activity among prison populations. The argument here is that's why it was common on board ships, and especially on board pirate ships in particular, was this particular experience that they had. Now, homosexuality in England, and specifically on naval vessels, is supposedly prohibited. There are penalties put in the 16th century, in the 1500s, although no one ever acts on them until the reign of Charles I, who becomes king in 1627. Charles was kind of a prude about sexuality, and he began insisting on enforcement of a law banning homosexual activity on board Royal Naval vessels. However, the number of cases that came up during the 17th century were minuscule. There's a handful of them, even though other reports clearly indicate that homosexual activity among members of the crews of Royal Naval vessels was very common, but only a few people get punished for it. It appears, at least, based on the evidence that we have, that punishment was focused on homosexual behavior only when it was disruptive to ship life. For example, a captain who is involved with several members of the crew and creating disruption thereby. You know, you're the captain's favorite, so how's he treating the rest of us, and this sort of thing. On a separate topic, you know, pedophilia, that again was punishable and would be punished in the Royal Navy. But for the cases of homosexuality, they were rarely punished. One example of actual punishment was a case involving this British citizen, John Durant, and a man named Abdul Rahim. They were convicted of engaging in homosexual activity on board a Royal Naval vessel. However, what the judge denounced in their behavior was the fact that Rahim was what he called a Hindustan peon. In other words, he wasn't a Christian. So the disruptive behavior here is that a Christian and a non-Christian are involved in a sexual relationship. Most of the cases, and again, there are only, I think it's less than a dozen that come up, involve behavior that is disruptive either to the crew or is perceived as potentially disruptive by naval officials. In other words, we can't have Christians and non-Christians involved in intimate relationships. We can't have a captain who's around establishing sexual relationships with several different crew members, because that causes disruption, that causes jealousy, etc. So even in this case, where the Royal Navy is supposedly punishing people engaged in this behavior, it's highly selective. They are only concerned in cases that are actually disruptive to the crew. And the evidence suggests, with these cases and with other observations, that in fact this kind of activity was highly prevalent in the Royal Navy in the 17th and certainly the 18th centuries. Now, the official penalty was supposed to be death, but in fact, almost in every case, lashes were administered. You know, there might be another punishment, you know, you're confined to quarters for 6 months or something, but usually lashes were the maximum punishment that was inflicted. So again, it's clear that they do not see this as some extreme crime. What they're concerned with is maintaining stability on board these ships, and that is how these incidents are treated. Now, as far as pirates go, pirate codes might prohibit women on board ship, and they certainly had rules about maintaining discipline and order and harmony on board ship in terms of their own codes of conduct, but they didn't explicitly prohibit homosexual activity. And in fact, evidence suggests, again from observers, people who were prisoners on board pirate ships, that it was highly prevalent. There was a large level or high level of homosexual activity among pirates on board ships. And again, at least one theoretical explanation is the fact that you're dealing with a total institution, that this is the only place where these people act together in terms of work, in terms of recreation, in terms of eating. All of this is confined to this one area. Affectionate relationships develop among the crew members, and there is a fairly high level of homosexual activity going on. Now, on the other hand, there is not what we would call a gay community among pirates, because their identity with each other is more than sexual. In other words, they are also crew members, they work together, they see themselves not simply in terms of the sexual activity they may be engaged in, but in the totality of the relationships they have with the people on board these ships. And so too, when they're on shore, you don't see them essentially separating out so that you have, you know, a tavern for gay sailors versus, you know, a tavern for straight sailors, because of course a large part of the population is engaged in homosexual activity, and they identify with each other as pirates, as men of the sea, rather than strictly on sexual preference or sexual identity. Furthermore, there is no sign of effeminacy among pirates. The idea that, you know, that this is a standard of homosexuality, well, first of all, it isn't. It's a small minority, including in the gay community. But among pirates in particular, there is no sign of that as being a significant value, practice, or habit among pirate crews. But the evidence suggests, again, from observations, though some of it's disputed, that there was a fairly high level of homosexual activity among members of pirate crews. And again, at least modern-day psychology would suggest some of the reason for this. And also, we need to remember what I mentioned at the beginning of this, is that people's sexual preferences and identities are not cast in stone in most cases. And they can shift depending upon conditions and environment. And the pirates, at least in the West, are one good example of that. Now, there's another case, and that is the case of the Chinese pirates and homosexuality. Here, we wouldn't have the same condition of the total institution, at least not in the sense of an all-male total institution, because as I talked about earlier, when we're dealing with Chinese pirates, we know that there's a significant number of women on board these ships. 10, 20, 30% certainly would be reasonable on most ships in terms of women. And yet, at the same time, we do know that homosexual activity was common among Chinese pirates as well. Now, one reason for this, and we talked about this with the leading pirates, homosexual activity may have been a form of bonding and initiation, bringing someone into the community. That this makes this person a part of the patron-client relationships that hold the pirate community together. So this is one possible explanation for homosexual relationships among Chinese pirates. Another factor that enters in here is that clearly some Chinese pirate leaders and captains, as well as others, were bisexual. And clearly their preferences moved in both directions in terms of sexual relationships. The specific example, of course, is Cheng Ai and Cheng Pao. Cheng Ai, of course, was the leader of the Chinese pirates, the senior captain. Cheng Pao was the young boy who he brought on board his ship after he was captured, makes him his lover, and then adopts him as a son. This would be a classic case of possibly bonding or initiation, bringing him in to this community. And at the same time, it also appears clear from Cheng Ai's behavior and that of others that many of these people were, or at least had bisexual relationships. In other words, they were involved with both males and females. Cheng Ai is one of several captains of the time who clearly engaged in both kinds of behavior. Now, one limitation on all of this is that, at least for the Chinese pirates, we're not sure how strong some of this evidence is. That evidence that comes from testimony by captured pirates is suspect for this reason. There are other forms of evidence, observations by people who were taken prisoner on board ship, just as with Western pirates. But when it comes to the Chinese pirates who were captured and then confessed, among other things, to homosexual activity, they may have been confessing for a very good reason, and that was to escape a worse punishment for piracy. If you say, well, look at, this guy brought me on board ship, he became my lover, and then he drew me into this piratical activity, okay, the punishment for you is 40 blows. On the other hand, if you're just a run-of-the-mill pirate, the punishment is beheading. So given the choice, of course, you say, well, guess what? I had a relationship with this guy, and that's why I became a pirate. So some of the evidence, that's why in trying to measure the degree of homosexual activity among pirates in China versus the West, some of the evidence has to be questioned because, at least when it comes to captured pirates and people who are being put on trial, they may at times have resorted to describing these relationships as a way of justifying their behavior, much preferring 40 blows to having their head lopped off for committing acts of piracy. But what we once again see is that pirate society was highly complex and included a significant amount of homosexual activity, although, again, given the historical era in which this is occurring, people recognize different types of sexual behavior by people, but they don't tend to group them and class them in that fashion. They don't tend to see others in those terms. Today, we tend to categorize people not only by their sexual behavior, but of course by your ethnicity, your male, female, your gender roles, but also your ethnicity. We tend to look at people in those ways. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, yes, people recognized homosexual activity, but that didn't mean they tended to group people solely on the basis of their sexual preference. That only comes in later times as we begin to categorize people, and as scientists want to tell us that, well, these are different groups of people based on their behavior patterns. But at this time, we see, in fact, that those kinds of perceptions don't exist, and we also see just how fluid human sexual identity and human sexual preference can be when we look at the behavior of pirates both in Asia and in the West. Now, another component of these highly complex societies were black pirates. This is another example of what was clearly a conglomerate community, a community made up of a vast diversity of human beings in terms of their experiences, their backgrounds, etc. We've already seen Afro-Creoles, or Africans who were essentially born in the Western Hemisphere, we've seen their activities as cimarrones, as people who had escaped slavery and established communities, particularly in Panama, although there were other communities along the north and western coasts of South America, of Afro-Creoles who had escaped slavery as well and set up these communities, and they were known as, the people are known as cimarrones, and we've seen them supporting English pirates in their attacks on Panama, and they themselves at times would engage in relatively minor piratical activity because most of them didn't have access to substantially sized vessels in order to do that. Another area of interaction between Africans and pirates has to do with the capture of slave ships. Now, in some cases, as we saw with Drake and Hawkins, the reason the pirates were seizing the slave ships was not to release the slaves, of course. They wanted to capture the ships, take the slaves to the Western Hemisphere and sell them. But there are a number of other cases, particularly in later years, where pirates came upon slave vessels, captured them, and then released the slaves. And not surprisingly, many of the slaves chose to join the pirate crews, partly because their own options were fairly limited in terms of what were they going to do. You know, where am I going to land that I'm not going to be enslaved again, etc. But there are a number of instances where ships of African slaves were freed by pirates, although it's not, again, there are different parts of evidence depending on which pirates you want to look at, those who were engaged in the slave trade themselves or those who chose to liberate slaves, obviously identifying with their condition given the origins of most of the pirates themselves. Exactly how many members of the pirate community were Afro-Creoles or Africans, we're not entirely sure, but there are some reasonably good guesses based on captured pirate ships where lists were made of their crews that around 25 to 30% of the crews of pirate ships, at least in the Spanish Main, were made up of Afro-Creoles or Africans. Some of these people, as with women, would rise to significant positions within pirate society. One of them was John Mapu. John Mapu was with Henry Morgan's expedition that attacked Portobello. And what is significant about John Mapu is that we know that he commanded one of the teams of pirates who attacked Portobello. He was in charge of one of those teams and therefore in charge of what was largely a white contingent of pirates attacking Portobello. One of the most interesting and distinguished people was Diego de los Reyes, means Diego of the Kings. He was involved as a Dutch pirate, although he wasn't Dutch, but was commanding Dutch pirate vessels in the Spanish Main in the 1630s and 40s. He had grown up as a slave in Cuba. He was known as Diego el Mulato. Sometime in the late 1620s, he was subjected to a severe whipping by his master. And that determined him to escape his situation and escape to the sea. And in 1629, he in fact escapes from the island on a small boat. He eventually encounters a group of Dutch pirates and joins up with them. He will, over time, become a captain of his own ship and lead a number of highly successful attacks on his former masters. In other words, attacks upon Spanish vessels and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean during the 1630s and 40s. And these are just a couple of examples of members of the Afro-Creole or African community who comprise a significant portion of pirate crews and rise to positions of command within pirate society. And it's something that is entirely understandable when we look at the kind of society that pirates are creating. This is one of relatively open opportunity, equal division of shares, election of captains, and of course a rejection of the standards of what was considered legitimate society at the time. So it's hardly surprising that many pirates, although not all of them, would identify with these people who had been victimized by slavery and would create opportunities for them within this community, and that some of them would advance to positions of command. If we sum up the pirates and their social history, who are they as a group, as a society, as a community? First of all, we can say without question that the vast majority of them are truly the wretched of the earth. They are the people who have largely been excluded from their own societies, who are born into poverty, who are desperately poor rural peasants in England, the egg people, the tanka, the boat people of the South China coast, people who have little or nothing in terms of material possessions, and who are shunned by their own society. They are social outcasts. And on top of that, the opportunities presented for them are largely limited to work on merchant vessels and naval vessels. And there, as we have seen, they are to lead an existence that is equally as miserable as that on shore. The only difference is they can at least earn their daily bread, or at least their daily sea biscuit. So this is where most of these people come from, and it helps us in understanding what kind of society they created, what kinds of communities they created, when you understand what their origins were and how they viewed the larger so-called legitimate societies into which they were born. They had gotten nothing from these societies. They had been oppressed by them, they had been exploited by them, and often in creating their own society, they would react against that experience and essentially try to turn around the society that they had known and create its opposite in the pirate communities that developed in places like the Caribbean and the South China Sea. Pirate activity is clearly a combination of both self-interest, and these are people who are trying to make some money. I mean, this is not a charity activity. You want to make money, and if possible, you want to become filthy rich, if you can do that. But it's also true, although not universally true of all pirates, that many of them directed their activities against the elite of their own societies, against authority figures, whether it was naval captains, colonial governors, the judicial system. Much of their activity was aimed in that direction. And for that reason, they do qualify, or many of them would qualify, as social bandits. In other words, people whose activities have not only a criminal intent, but also are a form of social protest against the kind of society that they actually live in. Conditions on pirate vessels, as we've seen, were generally better than those on merchant vessels and naval vessels. But at the same time, there were considerable deprivations, living conditions, the availability of food on a daily basis. But whatever those material conditions were, it's also clear from their behavior patterns that they did seek to create a freer society than the one that they had grown up with. After all, their societies elect their leaders, and they can remove their leaders. They divide up their wealth among themselves on a fairly equitable basis. At the same time, as they create this more equitable society, it's also clear that many of its rules, its regulations, are a deliberate rebellion against the rules and regulations of the larger societies in which they had been born. For women pirates, we see two different experiences. On the one hand, we see in the West some exceptional women in terms of their talents and abilities and what they accomplish as pirates, but also exceptional in the sense that they are rare cases. Males clearly wanted to exclude women, if at all possible, from this area of labor activity, because as desperate as they are for jobs, and as miserable as these jobs might be, nevertheless, they do want to exclude this area and to maintain this as a sphere of male activity. And of course, along the way, they can come up with various justifications, such as referring to women as Jonahs, and more practically, to point to the disruptive effect that the presence of women on board ship would have because of sexual jealousies. Of course, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because rarely were women on board ships, and so when they were in a small minority, and inevitably that would create sexual jealousies. Now, if there had been a large number of women on board, there would be far less of a problem. Just as with homosexual activity among the crew members, there's a lot less problem there because there were all kinds of potential partners available to you. So the complaint that women's presence will be disruptive because of sexual jealousies is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because by limiting the number of women on any ship, pirate or otherwise, to a handful means, anytime there were women on board, there were immediately going to be problems because there are so few of them. In terms of gay pirates, in terms of homosexual activity, we can say it's virtually a norm. I mean, this is a kind of activity, although we certainly can't say, gee, did all pirates engage in homosexual activity? Almost certainly not. Did most of them? We're not even sure it's that. We do know that it was a highly prevalent activity among pirates in both the West and in Asia. More importantly than that even is the fact that this is perceived as a norm. I mean, even the Royal Navy doesn't go after people unless their behavior is somehow disruptive or perceived to be disruptive. And among pirates, there simply is no attempt to punish people for this kind of behavior unless, and this could happen on a pirate ship as it could in the Royal Navy, unless people are engaged in sexual behavior that is disrupting the ship. That, let's say the quartermaster has a lover and is treating him with special preference, now you've created a problem. Now your behavior is a problem. Otherwise, this is not viewed as something extraordinary or out of the ordinary. So even though we can't count numbers and say, well, how many pirates actually engaged in homosexual activity, we don't know. What we do know is that it was not perceived as something out of the ordinary on pirate vessels during this period. And as for black pirates, again, pirate society for them was clearly an oasis of freedom, because almost inevitably, in the vast majority of cases, blacks who became pirates were escaping from slavery. We've also been able to look at the culture of pirates. And I think some of the important aspects of their culture are these. One, that this is a society, as interesting and as complex as it is, that has severe limitations. And most importantly, a lack of coherent institutions, permanent institutions that tie the society together, that make widespread cooperative activity possible. That simply never happened. To the extent that coherence exists in pirate society, it exists within individual communities, which really mean on board 1, 2, 3, maybe a half dozen ships. That larger coherence never develops among pirate communities. As we said, even with China, with the Confederation, that was a business association and did not reach beyond business association. And as a result, pirate society will have a hard time surviving in the long run because it can make no coordinated response to the attacks upon it. It has no cooperative basis on which it can respond to threats to its existence. As far as the violence that we talked about and torture, we have to qualify it, at least in part, as reprehensible, as repugnant as it may seem. Part of it is understandable because of the norms of societies at this time, not just pirate society, but larger societies. That treatment of people who are convicted of a crime or prisoners in terms of subjecting them to lashes, drawing and quartering, etc., these were considered the norm, and these were not considered inhumane punishments. Much of what was done to people in terms of physical mistreatment on board pirate vessels had rational purposes. Again, this isn't justifying it. I'm not saying it's humane, whether it happened then, now, or whenever. But there are rational purposes to some of it, and that in most of it. And that is either to punish crewmen for behavior that violated codes of conduct on board the ship, or two, to extract information from prisoners, particularly information that would lead to the acquisition of wealth. But there is also true that in some of the more extreme cases, such as the ones that I cited for you today, we are dealing with people who clearly, such as Olney, Blackbeard, etc., were psychopaths or sociopaths, however you want to describe them, people who had little, if any, sensibility about the suffering of other human beings, had basically no moral standard that would prevent them from doing this, no conscience as we understand it, and who actually apparently reveled in inflicting this kind of extreme brutality on other human beings. So all of that is a part of the reality of pirate culture. Going back and looking at what we've covered up to now, we've done 7 sessions, so we're just over the halfway mark in terms of what we're going to cover. And what I'm doing here is not going back into a detailed outline, but simply touching on some of the high points, if you will. One thing that we've looked at closely is sources of piracy over time in a set of locations. And we can affirm 2 things that help lead to a steady stream of people joining pirates as bandits on the high sea. One is poverty. Most of these people, the vast majority, are born into desperate poverty and have virtually no way of escaping it. And then, more specifically, in that larger group, those who go to the sea seeking some type of basic employment and finding, well, they might be able to survive in terms of earning their daily bread. Nevertheless, they are subjected to the most wretched of living conditions, and they are subjected to intense physical abuse by those who command them. Now, on the larger stage, what we've been looking at, particularly in recent weeks, is the causes of piracy and smuggling. And clearly, one of the central issues is the rise of trading empires. The empires that emerged based on essentially global trading networks, such as the Ottoman Empire, Spain, Portugal, England, etc., helped create conditions in which piracy could flourish. Not that piracy was unique. We talked briefly about ancient piracy, but here was a period after about 1200 AD, and particularly by 1500 AD, with the rise of the trading empires, that those empires themselves were going to create conditions in which pirates and smugglers would flourish. One of the factors is that pirates and privateers, who are, of course, those who have official license from a state system to engage in piracy, that these people are used by expanding trading empires to extend their reach. The Ottoman Empire and the Barbarossas, for example. The English and their privateers. The privateers are an informal army, as are pirates, who, if they are not operating under the official license of a government, are often operating with the unofficial, with the tacit approval of that state system, allowing them to prey on the wealth of other trading empires. And in the case of the Ottoman Empire, actually the pirates wind up building the new navy of the Ottoman Empire. So they become devices that are extremely valuable for trading empires, both to prey on their opponents, their competitors, and in order to extend their own naval power. Another factor that plays its role here, is particularly among the European trading empires, was this long tradition of mixing piracy and trade. That a merchant one day is a pirate the next. When the opportunity arises, use the cannon you have on board and attack another merchant vessel seize its property, and make your profit that way if things haven't gone so well in terms of legitimate trade. This we see time and again with the Portuguese in particular, but also with the Dutch, that you might call it a trading venture, but you could just as easily call it a piratical venture. It was just a question of what did they actually do once they got out to sea. That tradition further encourages this flourishing of piracy in the age of the trading empires. Another factor is that the trading empires establish exclusive trading networks. They are excluding people. Spain is the example we've looked at most frequently in its New World possessions. That's encouraging both smuggling and pirates. Here is where all the wealth is, and we're being excluded from it. These trading networks also inevitably create situations in which there is monopolistic pricing and therefore acute price differentials. The spice trade and the Portuguese and then the Dutch in Asia as an example. But even the Spanish in the New World, again, by excluding their colonies from trading with anyone else, they have caused prices to rise astronomically for goods that these colonies want to import from Europe. Therefore, there is both the encouragement for pirates to attack and seize some of these valuable goods, such as spices and silver, and there is every incentive for smugglers to join in the fray and smuggle goods to take advantage of the extraordinarily high prices created both for imported goods in the New World and for luxury goods such as spices, which are controlled by trading empires in Asia. Another factor that plays in here is that the creation of these trading empires, and we see this particularly in Asia and the Indian Ocean, often forces people who are simply merchants carrying out their normal business to become pirates and smugglers as the only way to survive. Because suddenly, for example, the Portuguese are issuing licenses and you can't trade without licenses. So not surprisingly, people along the West Indian coast turn to piracy and to smuggling. Otherwise, they can't survive in this kind of system. So too, colonists in Spain's possessions in the Western Hemisphere often feel that the only way they can survive is by smuggling in goods. Otherwise, they're going to starve to death or their economy is going to shrivel up and disappear. Piracy inevitably flourishes because of the attitudes of state systems. Often, the most frequent case we have seen is imperial indifference. And by that I mean really that, yes, the imperial system knows that piracy or smuggling is going on, but it is simply not worth the effort to try to wipe it out completely. It isn't worth it. You know, the Spanish, for example, yeah, they know all these pirates are out there, but of course they limit themselves to some shore defenses and to the fleet system. They don't send a large naval expedition to try to sweep the Caribbean of the pirates when they are a threat, because they aren't that big a threat. It would cost too much. And then the other example as to why piracy would flourish because of imperial attitudes is the weakening of the imperial system. Why do the pirates of the South China Sea flourish? Because China's imperial system is rapidly weakening under the Manchu and the Qin, and they are increasingly incapable under this system with the divisions in the military, etc., to take on the task of reducing these pirates and eliminating them, particularly when they count in the tens of thousands ultimately. They are such an enormous force, and the Chinese government is becoming so weak. So imperial decline can be another motive. Then another thing we looked at besides the forces promoting piracy was the decline of piracy. The particular example we used was the Spanish Main and the rise of the Sugar Islands. That one of the reasons piracy flourished is because colonial governors and colonial merchants were more than happy to see the pirates operating in the Caribbean and operating on British and French possessions because their economies did not have a great deal to build on at that time. The pirates brought merchandise which could help their economies to flourish. But as we get into the end of the 17th century, as sugar becomes a larger and larger part of their economies, there is less and less patience with the pirates because they are less and less important to the proper functioning of their economies. Peace in Europe, for two reasons, particularly the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. It means, one, that piracy is going to become more of a problem. There are tens of thousands of unemployed seamen. There are going to be more pirates, so the pirates are a bigger threat. And at the same time, it means that the naval forces of Europe, particularly the British, but also the French, now have the opportunity to focus their attention on the Caribbean and the suppression of the pirates. Another factor that contributes to their downfall is, if you will, the anarchism of the freebooters. In other words, these are people, as we've just seen today in talking about their social history, that were challenging authority in general, and they didn't care who they attacked. French, British, Dutch, didn't make any difference. So they now would become a general threat to everyone. So they were going to have to go. In China, we have a different case, because there we have the issue of the pirate confederation and how it was organized, and the fact that it really couldn't prevent its members from departing, which meant when the opportunity was there, when they had accumulated significant wealth, and when they had an offer of amnesty and actually official positions within the government, they were free to take advantage of that and withdraw from the confederation, which is precisely what their principal leaders did at that time. Finally, there is, of course, the war on piracy itself, which was particularly effective in the Caribbean in terms of putting a sufficient number of naval vessels in the water at the same time, hunting pirates. And as I've mentioned on numerous occasions, when it comes to a pirate vessel combating a naval vessel, the odds are all in favor of the naval vessel winning. Once sufficient manpower and ships could be put in place along the east coast of the British colonies in North America and the Caribbean, the game was over. And effectively, it was over by the mid-1720s. And finally, again, what we've just covered today, our last major segment in the first half of the course, the social history of pirates. Again, that whatever their other motives, and certainly greed was a major one, an important aspect of many pirates, although not all of them, we certainly wouldn't count Drake among these, but an important aspect was social banditry, was attacking the elite, attacking the authority structures of their own society, rebelling against it. We see that pirate societies also created relatively free and open spaces for their people, an opportunity to acquire at least some share of wealth, an opportunity for freedom in terms of sexual preferences, an opportunity for groups of escaped slaves to find a position in this new society and even assume positions of leadership. We've looked at violence and how much of this violence was reflective of the norms of legitimate societies of the time, although some of it was the work of psychopaths. But it is also true that most of the violence inflicted by pirates had rational, albeit not humane, motivations: to punish crewmen or to extract information from prisoners. And finally, we've talked about the limits of pirate society. Without social institutions that could survive over time, pirate society would be a fleeting phenomena. It would disintegrate ultimately, whether we're talking about the Mediterranean, whether we're talking about the Spanish Main or the South China Sea. These were not permanent institutions. These were not societies that would carry on for centuries and leave an indelible set of marks and values upon us. They are historical phenomena because of the internal weakness of these societies themselves. They were fragmented and atomized. They would not survive over the course of history itself. They are left to us as a fascinating example of free enclaves, rebellious enclaves, created by the wretched of the earth. Until next week.